I never thought my father's fists would silence me in front of a room full of people. But that night, as my jaw cracked and the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth, I realized how wrong I was. The celebration was supposed to honor him, his 60th birthday, a grand display of wealth and respectability. The Carter estate sparkled with lights, neighbors, and business partners sipping expensive wine, the air thick with polite laughter. I stood near the cake, my hand trembling as I held a glass of water, already bracing for the tension I knew would come. My father, Richard Carter, was always waiting for a chance to humiliate me, and my mother, Diane, never failed to encourage him. When his voice boomed across the room, my body stiffened. "Natalie," he growled, "come here and sign the papers. Tonight!" His eyes pinned me like a predator ready to pounce. He wanted me to hand over the deed to my apartment, the only space I could call mine, to my younger brother, Ethan. For him, it was nothing but control, a way to remind me I had no power in his house. I shook my head. No, Dad, not tonight. Not ever. For a split second, silence froze the entire room. Guests turned forks, hovering in midair champagne flutes paused at their lips. Then his face twisted with rage. He closed the distance in 2 strides, his fist clenched. Before I could even raise my hands, the blow landed. A sickening crack echoed as my jaw gave way, white pain shooting through my skull. My knees buckled. The glass in my hand shattered against the marble floor. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but no one moved to stop him. Blood poured down my chin, warm and sticky, staining the neckline of my dress. My vision blurred. Somewhere deep inside me a scream rose, but it was trapped, strangled by the pain. And then came the sound that cut deeper than the punch itself, the scratch of a lighter. I forced my eyes upward. My mother Diane leaned against the grand piano, casually flicking her lighter a cigarette between her painted lips. The flame caught, and she inhaled slowly, eyes locked on me with detached amusement. A cloud of smoke curled above her head as she exhaled, her voice slicing through the shocked silence. Finally, she said, her mouth curling into a smile. "You're silent." The cruelty in her tone seared worse than the pain in my jaw. My father towered above me, breathing hard, his hand still raised while my mother smirked as though the spectacle was entertainment. No one clapped. No one intervened. Faces turned away, eyes glued to the floor, some pretending to sip their drinks, others whispering into their hands. It was easier to ignore than to confront the ugly truth. On the floor, tasting blood and humiliation, I realized the betrayal was complete. This wasn't just a violent outburst, it was a carefully orchestrated show of power. My father wanted submission, and my mother wanted silence. They had achieved both, at least for that moment. But as I knelt there trembling, jaw throbbing, my thoughts cut through the haze of pain. I would not remain silent forever. If they thought this punch would break me, they were wrong. They had no idea what I had been preparing, no idea what evidence I had hidden, no idea that their empire of lies was about to crumble. And though I could barely breathe, though the world spun in fragments of pain and smoke, a spark of defiance burned inside me. They thought they had silenced me. They had only lit the fuse. From the outside, the Carters were a picture of elegance and stability. People in town would point to our mansion on Oakwood Drive as proof that hard work and family values could build an empire. Neighbors waved at my father when he drove by in his black Mercedes. Children whispered about how lucky Ethan and I must be to live behind iron gates and marble pillars. Local newspapers ran flattering stories about my mother's charity work, her photo always carefully posed with a check in hand and a gentle smile painted across her face. No one ever asked where that money truly came from, and no one dared question the cracks beneath the polished surface. Guests who came for dinners admired the crystal chandeliers and the grand piano. They praised the manicured gardens, the shimmering pool, the perfect rose bushes my mother tended to only when photographers were around. To outsiders, we were flawless. But inside those walls, perfection was nothing but a weapon. My father, Richard Carter, built his reputation on control. Control of his company, control of the money, control of every word that came out of my mouth. He wore tailored suits that cost more than most people's cars. His smile a mask hiding the temper that lurked beneath. To the world, he was generous, decisive, admirable. To me, he was a storm waiting to strike. My mother, Diane, was even more dangerous in her own way. She perfected the role of the doting wife, the woman who raised money for hospitals, who chaired events at the country club. But when the lights dimmed and the guests drove home, she was cold steel. Her laughter, which charmed strangers, turned sharp and cruel behind closed doors. She never raised her hand like my father did, but her silence, her smirks, her whispered encouragements, those wounds cut deeper. People praised her beauty, her poise, her grace, never realizing she was the one who lit the matches behind the curtains. And then there was Ethan, my younger brother. To the neighborhood, he was the golden boy. Straight A's in school, quarterback of the high school football team, the boy every parent wanted their child to date. He received the newest cars, the best tutors, the most expensive trips abroad. To me, he was a constant reminder that love in our family was conditional. Ethan could do no wrong. I, on the other hand, could do no right. The favoritism was not subtle. It was carved into every holiday, every dinner, every family gathering. He got a car on his 17th birthday. I got silence. He was praised for bringing home a B. I was slapped for bringing home an A-. I lived in a house of illusions where the chandelier sparkled while the shadows deepened. The betrayal was that everyone in town envied me, dreamed of being me, when in reality I was suffocating in a gilded cage. I wanted to scream whenever someone said, "You must be so proud to be a Carter." Proud. How could I be proud of a father who saw me as property of a mother, who saw me as competition of a brother, who saw me as nothing? It was all a facade, a performance we played so well that even I sometimes wondered if I was crazy for seeing through it. But the bruises were real. The whispers at night were real. The fear that crawled up my spine whenever I heard my father's footsteps in the hallway was real. The Carters looked perfect on the outside. On the inside, we were a family rotting from the core, and I was the only one willing to admit it. I was 12 the first time my father's hand cracked against my face, hard enough to make the world spin. The reason was almost laughable now. I forgot to polish his shoes before a dinner meeting. I still remember the leather smell of those shoes, sharp and heavy, the shine reflecting my trembling hands as I tried to finish the chore in time. He noticed a single scuff mark and his face darkened. Before I could apologize, the slap landed my lip split and I crashed into the hallway wall. My mother stood at the bottom of the stairs, her arms crossed. She didn't gasp, didn't rush to my side. Instead, she shook her head slowly and said, "You had it coming, Natalie. Maybe next time you'll learn." That was the moment I realized she would never be my shield. Most nights I lay awake listening for footsteps. The creak of the floorboards outside my door meant danger. My father didn't need a reason. Sometimes it was a grade lower than perfect. Sometimes it was the tone of my voice. Sometimes it was simply because Ethan had done something wrong and I was easier to punish. Ethan would smirk at me from across the dinner table, a smear of barbecue sauce on his cheek, knowing full well that my silence bought him freedom. He learned early that aligning himself with my parents meant protection. I learned that being their daughter meant being their scapegoat. School became my only sanctuary, but even there the bruises followed me. I wrapped scarves around my neck in spring, lied about falling off my bike, about bumping into lockers. My teachers looked at me with suspicion, but no one asked too many questions. Who would dare accuse the Carters of abuse? Everyone saw the gala photos, the charity auctions, the glittering smiles. Who would believe the girl hidden behind them? There was one teacher, Mrs. Alden, who noticed more than the rest. She pulled me aside after class, once her voice gentle. "If you ever need someone to talk to Natalie, my door is open." I wanted to tell her everything, but the fear of what my father would do if he found out sealed my lips. I nodded and walked away, the words strangling me from the inside. By 14, I stopped trying to seek comfort. I learned to swallow the pain, to journal in secret, writing down every slap, every bruise, every cruel word. Those pages became my only witnesses, the ink blotted with tears I dared not cry out loud. Holidays were the worst. The house would be filled with relatives, laughter echoing through the halls, champagne glasses clinking. My father played the gracious host, my mother dazzled in her gowns, Ethan showed off his new gifts. And me, I was the servant carrying trays, forced to smile. Once on Christmas Eve, my father gripped my arm so hard it left a purple imprint shaped like his hand. He leaned down, his breath thick with whiskey, and whispered, "Remember, you exist because I allow it." When I pulled my sleeve down to cover the mark, my mother glanced at me from across the room. She lifted her glass of wine and smirked as though it were an inside joke. That memory burned into me more painful than the bruise itself. Growing up in that house meant learning that love was a performance. I learned how to laugh when I wanted to cry, how to thank them when they destroyed me, how to disappear in a room full of people. I also learned that survival required silence, but silence was its own kind of prison. I swore that one day I would find a way to break free. I didn't know then how or when, but the vow etched itself deep inside me even as I traced the shape of bruises in the mirror. As the years passed, the violence stopped being isolated outbursts and became a routine. By the time I was 19, it wasn't a question of if my father would hit me, but when. His temper was like clockwork, tied to his business deals, to the mood of the stock market, to whether Ethan had pleased him that day. When Richard Carter felt powerless in the boardroom, he came home looking for control. And I was the target he always found. One night after dinner, he shoved a stack of documents in front of me. It was a mortgage agreement for my grandmother's old house, the one she left me in her will. "Sign it," he barked, his finger jabbing at the dotted line. "The company needs collateral." I stared at the papers, my hands trembling. That house was the only piece of my grandmother I had left a place of warmth and safety when everything else had been cold. I shook my head. "No, I won't." His face darkened, and in an instant his boot slammed into my ribs. Pain shot through my side, knocking the air out of me. I gasped, clutching my stomach, the room spinning. My mother sat at the table, swirling her wine, her eyes calm. "Better broken than disrespectful," she murmured, not even glancing at me. Ethan, seated across from me, smirked, his fork tapping against his plate. That was how my family worked. My father delivered the blows, my mother justified them, and my brother enjoyed the show. The bruises on my ribs lasted for weeks, a constant reminder of how little I mattered to them. But that wasn't the only time. There were countless others. A missed chore meant a slap across the face. A question about money meant a fist against the wall beside my head. Refusing to lend Ethan my car once ended with me shoved into the staircase so hard my back ached for months. Every protest, every ounce of resistance was met with violence designed to crush me into silence. Yet what cut deeper than the fists or kicks were the words. My father never missed an opportunity to remind me that I was worthless, that no one would believe me, that without his name, I was nothing. My mother added her own venom, often whispered, while I nursed bruises in the bathroom. "If you just kept your mouth shut, none of this would happen. You bring it on yourself." Over time, the physical pain became predictable, almost dull in its familiarity. What never dulled was the betrayal, the realization that my own mother not only refused to protect me, but actively took pleasure in my suffering. It was her smirk, her dismissive shrug that hollowed me out inside. Every time I tried to cling to the memory of her tucking me into bed as a child, her present cruelty shattered it. By my mid-20s, the pattern was clear. My father didn't just want obedience. He wanted erasure. My mother didn't just want peace. She wanted dominance over me. And Ethan didn't just want to be the favorite. He wanted me gone entirely. Each act of violence wasn't random. It was part of a campaign to strip me of everything: my voice, my independence, my dignity. What they didn't realize was that with every blow, they weren't breaking me. They were forging me. I learned how to endure, how to mask pain, how to think 3 steps ahead. I learned how to survive in silence while quietly preparing for the day I would no longer be silent at all. It was after that night with the mortgage papers and the kick to my ribs that something inside me shifted. The pain lingered for weeks, but what burned deeper was the memory of my mother's voice, calm, casual, as though I deserved to be broken. I realized then that nothing would ever change unless I created the change myself. Crying in silence, hiding my bruises, pretending for neighbors, it had only fueled their cruelty. If they wanted me silent, then silence would be my weapon. I began to write. At first, it was just scribbles in an old notebook I kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in my closet. Every slap, every kick, every word of venom they went onto the pages. Dates, times, details. I wrote about the color of the bruise on my thigh, the smell of whiskey on my father's breath, the way my mother's eyes gleamed when she whispered her contempt. It was my truth carved in ink. But writing wasn't enough. I needed proof no one could deny. I saved the small tape recorder I once used for school projects. I started carrying it in my jacket pocket, hidden and ready. The first time I caught my father on tape, he was screaming that he'd break every bone in my body if I didn't do as I was told. His voice was unmistakable, his rage clear. When I played it back in secret, a chill ran through me. For the first time, I held evidence of the monster behind the mask. I grew bolder. I snapped photos of bruises with a disposable camera I bought with cash. I learned how to angle the shots to capture the handprint on my arm, the purple bloom on my ribs. I labeled each photo with the date, slipped them into an envelope, and hid them away. My journal grew thicker, its pages no longer just words, but also taped photographs, transcripts of recordings, printed emails where my mother mocked me. Every artifact became a piece of armor. Still, I knew I couldn't keep everything under one roof. If my father ever discovered it, I would pay with more than bruises. So I turned to the only adult I had ever trusted, Mrs. Alden, my old English teacher. One evening, trembling, I knocked on her door. She looked at me at the fading bruise under my eye and without a word ushered me inside. Over tea, I slid the envelope of photos across her table. My hands shook as I whispered, "Please, keep these safe. If anything happens to me, make sure someone sees them." She didn't hesitate. She pressed her hand over mine and said, "Natalie, you're not alone anymore." That night, for the first time in years, I felt the faintest glimmer of safety. With her help, I began to organize everything like a case file. She connected me with a young lawyer, Grace Monroe, who advised me quietly. Grace explained the importance of timelines, consistency, witnesses. "The truth is on your side," she said, "but we need to make it undeniable." I walked out of her office with a folder, a plan, and a sense of resolve I had never known. My silence had once been a prison, but now it was a strategy. They thought I was beaten, broken, obedient. In reality, I was documenting everything, preparing for the moment when the facade would crack wide open. Each bruise became more than pain. It became evidence. Each cruel word became more than an insult. It became a weapon. I would turn back on them. By the time I was 27, I had amassed years of records. Hidden drives, sealed envelopes, trusted allies. I was no longer just surviving. I was building a case brick by brick. And though my jaw still ached on rainy days, though my ribs bore the memory of kicks, my spirit no longer bent under their weight. They thought they had silenced me. They had no idea I was learning how to make my voice louder than they ever imagined. The night of my father's 60th birthday was supposed to be a celebration of his power, his legacy, his perfect family. The mansion was draped in gold and white crystal chandeliers, blazing, champagne flowing. Business partners, politicians, neighbors all gathered to honor Richard Carter, the man they believed was a pillar of strength. I stood in the corner, my jaw tight, my dress simple compared to the glittering gowns around me. I had promised myself I would endure the evening quietly, smile when required, nod when spoken to keep the peace. But my father had other plans. He always did. As the evening wound down, Richard clinked his glass for silence. His voice boomed across the hall, commanding attention. "Tonight, I want to share not just my gratitude, but also my vision for the future of our family." Guests applauded politely, eyes shining with admiration. He turned toward me, his gaze sharp. "Natalie, come forward." My stomach sank. I knew that tone. It wasn't an invitation. It was an order. Slowly, I stepped forward, every eye on me. My father held out a folder documents. My heart pounded. I knew instantly what they were. The deed to my apartment, the one place I called mine. "Sign it," he demanded. "Tonight. As a gift to your brother." Gasps whispered through the crowd. Ethan smirked from his seat, already victorious. I felt my body tremble, the memory of past beatings flashing through me. My mother sat nearby, lighting a cigarette, her red lips curving into a cold smile. For a moment, I wanted to give in to sign just to avoid the storm I knew was coming. But then I remembered the journal, the photos, the recordings. I remembered Mrs. Alden's steady hand and Grace Monroe's voice telling me, "You are stronger than they believe." My hands curled into fists. "No," I said firmly, my voice steady. The silence in the room was suffocating. My father's eyes narrowed, his face darkening with rage. He slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Then before I could move, his fist shot out. The blow cracked against my jaw, white-hot pain exploding through my skull. I stumbled back, my glass slipping from my hand and shattering against the marble floor. The room gasped, but no one moved. Blood poured from my mouth, warm and metallic, dripping onto my dress. My knees hit the ground. My ears rang. And then I heard it, the scratch of a lighter. I forced my blurry vision upward. My mother leaned back in her chair, cigarette between her fingers, smoke curling in the air. She took a slow drag, exhaled, and said in a voice dripping with satisfaction, "Finally, you're silent." Laughter rippled from her lips as though the scene unfolding before her was a comedy, not a tragedy. My father towered above me, chest heaving, his hand still raised. Around us, guests froze. Some looked horrified, others glanced away. No one dared intervene. They were too afraid of Richard Carter, too invested in his approval. My brother Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head as if this were all entertainment. I tasted blood, humiliation, fury. But beneath the haze of pain, something else stirred. Defiance. They thought they had silenced me, that this public humiliation would crush the last piece of fight I had left. What they didn't know was that this was the breaking point, not for me, but for them. As I clutched my jaw, struggling to breathe, I whispered inside my head, the vow I had carried for years. "You will pay for this. Every slap, every bruise, every word, I will make the world see you for what you are." The crowd might have stayed silent that night, but silence would not protect my parents forever, because the truth was no longer trapped in my journal. It was waiting, and soon it would explode louder than my father's fist ever could. The morning after the party, I woke in a hospital bed, my jaw swollen and bandaged, my ribs aching with every shallow breath. The doctor's words blurred in my ears, but I caught the essentials: hairline fracture stitches, soft foods for weeks. When I asked who had brought me in, the nurse said it was a neighbor, not my parents. Of course not. Richard and Diane had gone home to finish their champagne, to spin their story of the night, to ensure their reputations remained untarnished. Lying there, pain coursing through me, I knew I had reached the edge. Survival was no longer enough. It was time to fight back. I contacted Grace Monroe, the young lawyer Mrs. Alden had introduced me to months earlier. She arrived at the hospital, her sharp eyes scanning my injuries, her lips pressing into a grim line. "This is exactly what we needed," she said quietly. She explained how the assault in front of witnesses, combined with the years of evidence I had collected, could build a case too strong to ignore. But Grace also knew my father's influence. If we go in unprepared, he'll bury us with money threats and lies. We need leverage. We need the court of public opinion on our side. That was where Daniel Brooks came in. Daniel had been my friend in college now, a freelance journalist known for exposing corruption. When he saw the photos, the recordings, the journal entries, his face hardened. "Natalie, this isn't just a family scandal. This is a story people need to hear. But we'll time it right. Not yet. When it will do the most damage." Over the next weeks, while my jaw healed, we worked in secret. Grace guided me through the legal maze, drafting statements, filing protective measures, securing copies of my evidence in multiple safe locations. Daniel helped me organize the recordings and photos into a timeline that painted a devastating picture of systematic abuse. He spoke to former employees of my father's company, people who had seen glimpses of Richard's temper, who whispered about shady deals and threats. Bit by bit, we were weaving a net. At home, nothing changed on the surface. My father strutted around the estate, acting as though the incident at the party had been nothing but a minor family dispute. My mother continued her charity events, smiling for photographers, her hand resting delicately on my father's arm. Ethan bragged to friends about the apartment he would soon inherit, certain I would cave. They all thought I was retreating, cowed by pain. They couldn't see the meetings, the files being built, the storm gathering around them. The more evidence I collected, the more reckless my family became. One evening, I placed a hidden camera in the living room. Hours later, I captured my father screaming at me, threatening to throw me out into the street like trash if I didn't sign over the property. My mother's voice cut through the recording, calm and venomous. "Do it, Richard. She needs to learn. Break her if you have to." That recording alone was dynamite. But the most shocking twist came from Ethan. Late one night, I overheard him bragging to his girlfriend on the phone. He laughed, saying, "Once she's out of the way, the house, the apartment, everything's mine." Dad promised. Mom, too. Natalie's just a placeholder. I recorded that, too. It was proof that their campaign wasn't just cruelty. It was calculated theft, a conspiracy to strip me of everything. Grace's eyes gleamed when she heard it. "This isn't just domestic violence anymore. This is financial abuse, coercion, conspiracy. This could put them all behind bars." For the first time in my life, I felt something close to hope. My family's arrogance had blinded them, made them careless. They thought I was alone, weak, silent. In reality, I was gathering allies, building a case, preparing to strike where it would hurt most publicly, undeniably, irrevocably. The plan was simple in structure, but devastating in impact. We would wait for the next grand event, one of my mother's charity galas, when the entire town, the press, and half the state's elite would be watching. And then, at the perfect moment, the truth would pour out, every lie stripped away, every mask ripped off. As I lay in bed at night, clutching my journal, my ribs aching, I repeated the vow to myself. They thought they had silenced me with fists and cruelty. But silence was never weakness. It was preparation. And soon, my silence would end with an explosion they could never contain. The night of the charity gala arrived like a stage set for a final act. My mother had spent weeks boasting about it to anyone who would listen. She wanted headlines praising her elegance, photos splashed across society pages, the illusion of the perfect Carter family standing tall once more. The ballroom at the downtown hotel glittered with chandeliers, every table draped in silk and gold. Politicians mingled with CEOs, journalists hovered with cameras, and waiters floated with trays of champagne. To the outside world, it was a triumph. To me, it was the battlefield. I arrived late, deliberately wearing a simple black dress that made me invisible among the sequins and diamonds. My jaw had mostly healed, but a faint scar lingered beneath the powder. My parents didn't expect me to show. When my father saw me enter, his smile faltered for a heartbeat before he masked it. My mother's eyes narrowed, the cigarette she had been holding outside, replaced with a glass of wine. Ethan chuckled at our table, whispering something to his friends. They thought I was walking into humiliation again. They didn't know the storm in my purse, a USB drive containing every journal entry, every photo, every recording. As speeches began, my mother glided onto the stage. "We gather tonight," she purred, "to celebrate not only generosity, but the strength of family. The Carter family has always believed in giving back." Her words were knives disguised as honey. Applause erupted. Cameras flashed. I waited until the room quieted, then rose to my feet. My heart hammered, but my voice was steady. "That's a lie." Every head turned. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. My mother froze, her smile brittle. My father's glare could have cut glass. "Natalie," he hissed, "sit down." But I didn't. I walked to the edge of the stage, heels clicking on marble, and held up the USB. "If this family is so strong, then let's show the truth." Gasps echoed. The technician hesitated when I handed him the drive, but Daniel Brooks, blending in among the journalists, stepped forward. "Play it," he said firmly. The screen behind the stage flickered. At first, photos appeared: bruises on my arms, purple marks across my ribs, a split lip. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Then came the audio, my father's voice booming. "I'll break every bone if you don't obey." Then my mother's voice, calm and cruel. Better broken than disrespectful. The room fell into stunned silence. I could feel every eye on me, but I wasn't trembling anymore. I stood tall as the next clip played Ethan's smug voice on the phone. "Once she's out of the way, the house, the apartment, everything's mine. Dad promised. Mom, too." Gasps turned to outrage. A woman near the front covered her mouth. A man muttered, Dear God! My father lunged toward the technician, but Grace Monroe, standing at the back with uniformed officers, raised a hand. The police stepped forward, blocking his path. Enough, I said loudly, my voice cutting through the chaos. You wanted me silent. You thought fists, threats, and cruelty would erase me. But silence gave me time. Time to gather proof. Time to make sure everyone sees who you really are. For the first time in my life, my father looked cornered. My mother's hand shook her glass of wine, spilling onto her gown. Ethan stammered, face pale. The facade they had built for decades crumbled in seconds. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, recording every detail. The illusion of perfection shattered in front of the very people they had sought to impress. My father roared, "This is all lies," but the audio playing behind him betrayed his words. My mother tried to stand tall, but the smirk was gone, her mask slipping as the evidence mounted. The chief officer stepped onto the stage. "Richard Carter, you are under arrest for aggravated assault, coercion, and conspiracy." Gasps thundered. My father's face drained of color as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. My mother shouted, "You can't do this! He's Richard Carter!" But the cameras captured everything, her desperation, her downfall. Ethan bolted for the door, only to be stopped by another officer. As the crowd erupted into shocked whispers, I took a breath, my chest rising steady. For years they had silenced me. Tonight, in front of everyone who once envied us, the truth spoke louder than any lie they had told. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. The ballroom erupted into chaos as the officers tightened the cuffs around my father's wrists. For decades, Richard Carter had been the one to command every room he entered, his voice louder than reason, his presence heavier than truth. But tonight, he stood cornered under blinding lights, the world finally seeing him for what he was. He jerked against the officer's grip, spitting curses, his face red with fury. "You can't do this to me. I built this town. I own half of you." His words echoed, but instead of fear, they drew whispers of disgust. Guests pulled out their phones, capturing every second, broadcasting his downfall in real time. The mask was gone. My mother rushed forward, grabbing his arm as if she could yank him free. "Richard, say something. Stop them!" Her cigarette-stained fingers clutched desperately, her voice shrill. The polished, elegant Diane who charmed donors and reporters had vanished. In her place stood a panicked woman watching her empire collapse. One of the officers gently pulled her back. "Ma'am, step aside." But Diane wasn't finished. She spun toward me, her eyes blazing. "You think this makes you strong? Natalie, you've destroyed your own family. You've humiliated us in front of everyone." Her words should have cut, but they didn't. For the first time, I felt untouchable. I lifted my chin, blood still pounding in my ears. "No, Mother. You did that yourselves. I just stopped protecting your lies." The room buzzed. Some guests looked away in shame. Others leaned in, hungry for every word. The illusion of the perfect Carter family had shattered beyond repair. Ethan tried to slip toward the exit, his suit jacket clutched tightly around him, but another officer intercepted him. "Ethan Carter, you're coming with us for questioning." His face drained of color. "Wait. What? I didn't do anything." But then the audio replayed his own voice echoing across the speakers. "Once she's out of the way, the house, the apartment, everything's mine." He crumpled, muttering protests no one believed. Grace Monroe stepped up beside me, her expression calm but triumphant. She leaned close and whispered, "It's done. They can't hide from this anymore." The officers began leading my father out of the ballroom. The crowd parted like the Red Sea people pulling back their chairs, whispers following him like a plague. For once, Richard Carter had no control, no authority, no mask to shield him. He was just a man in handcuffs, undone by his own arrogance. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. "Mr. Carter, do you deny the charges?" "Mrs. Carter, how long has this abuse gone on?" "Ethan, did you conspire against your sister?" Their silence was deafening. My father growled, my mother stammered, Ethan kept his head down. The perfect family portrait was gone, replaced by three villains exposed under the harshest light. As they disappeared through the ballroom doors, the tension broke. People began murmuring louder, some shaking their heads, others clapping me on the shoulder as if I were a survivor of war. One woman whispered, "I had no idea." "You're so brave," a man muttered. About time someone stopped him. But their sympathy didn't matter to me as much as the sheer relief flooding my chest. After years of fear of swallowing screams of covering bruises with scarves I had spoken, and the world had listened. Outside, flashing red and blue lights painted the night sky. I stepped onto the hotel steps just as my father was pushed into the back of a squad car. He turned his head, his eyes meeting mine, filled with rage and disbelief. For once, I didn't flinch. I met his stare with steady calm, then turned away. My mother stood on the curb screaming at the reporters. "We're victims of a setup. She's lying. This is all lies." But her words dissolved into the night air, ignored, mocked, recorded. Diane Carter, the woman who had once commanded every fundraiser, now looked like a cornered fraud, her power gone. As the cars pulled away, Grace touched my arm. "Natalie, this is just the beginning. The court cases will take time, but the evidence is overwhelming. They won't escape this." For the first time in years, I felt the weight lift. Justice had finally arrived, not just whispered in secret, not just scribbled in a journal, but real, visible, undeniable. My family's empire had crumbled, and I was still standing. The trial came faster than anyone expected. Richard Carter's name once meant influence and intimidation, but in the weeks following the gala, it became synonymous with scandal. Headlines screamed, "Business tycoon accused of abusing daughter perfect family," or "House of Lies." His face, once smiling on magazine covers, now appeared on the evening news with the word "indicted" stamped across the screen. In court, the evidence spoke louder than I ever could. The recordings played my father's threats, filling the sterile air. The photographs of bruises, the medical reports from the hospital, the timeline I had kept so carefully, they were undeniable. Witnesses came forward, too. Former employees testified about his temper, about the fear that lingered in the office hallways. A neighbor recalled the night he heard shouting and saw me stumbling outside with a bloodied lip. Piece by piece, the image of Richard Carter as a respectable patriarch crumbled. He tried to defend himself, of course. His lawyers painted me as unstable, ungrateful, even manipulative. But every time they tried to twist the story, Grace Monroe dismantled them with precision. When they claimed my injuries were accidents, she pressed play on the audio of my father screaming he would break every bone. When they implied I exaggerated, she presented the photographs time-stamped to the hospital records signed by doctors. When they argued I had plotted to ruin him, Daniel Brooks published his article in the city's largest paper, detailing years of abuse and the gala's public reveal. Public opinion turned. Jurors' faces hardened. There was no escape. The verdict came after 3 weeks guilty of aggravated assault, coercion, and attempted fraud. My father's jaw clenched as the judge read the sentence: 12 years in state prison. The man who once towered over me, fist raised, now stood shackled, powerless. I watched him led away, and though part of me ached with the memory of the little girl who once begged for his approval, the stronger part of me finally felt free. My mother didn't escape either. Diane Carter was charged with conspiracy and financial misconduct after investigators uncovered irregularities in her charity accounts. The gala funds the donations, the expenses, so many numbers twisted for her benefit. She tried to play the victim crying on the stand, insisting she had been manipulated by her husband. But the recordings betrayed her, her voice calm and venomous, encouraging my father to hurt me, her smirk immortalized in photographs from the party. The jury saw her not as a victim, but as a willing accomplice. She received 5 years, not in a luxury prison, but in a women's correctional facility. The woman who once commanded every ballroom now sat in a gray jumpsuit stripped of her illusions. Ethan, my golden brother, fared no better. His taped words about inheriting everything destroyed him. Colleges revoked their offers, friends abandoned him, and creditors circled when they discovered the loans he had hidden under my father's name. Within months, his bank accounts were frozen. His car repossessed, his reputation shattered. He left town quietly, but not before shouting at me outside the courthouse. "You ruined us." I didn't respond. He had chosen his side long ago. The Carter name, once untouchable, was now mud. The mansion on Oakwood Drive was seized, its gates rusting, its roses withering without care. Neighbors whispered not with envy but with contempt. The empire of lies had collapsed under its own weight. And me, I walked out of the courthouse with my head high. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but for the first time, I wasn't hiding. I answered simply, "The truth is painful, but silence is worse." I chose to speak. The words spread, quoted in headlines, echoed in interviews. I was no longer the invisible daughter, the scapegoat, the girl forced into silence. I was the voice that ended the cycle. Justice hadn't healed all my scars, but it had carved a line in stone. I would never belong to their darkness again. 6 months after the verdict, I stood in front of a crowded auditorium, my palms resting on the podium, the microphone humming softly. Rows of faces looked up at me, students, survivors, advocates, people who had never met me but who understood the weight of silence. Behind me, a banner read, "Voices Against Abuse." I took a breath, feeling the faint stiffness in my jaw, the scar that would never fully fade. It was no longer a mark of shame. It was proof I had endured and I had won. In those months, my life transformed. I left the husk of the Carter mansion behind, selling what remained of my parents' assets to cover legal fees and donate to shelters. I moved into a modest apartment downtown, a place filled with sunlight and quiet. For the first time, I chose the furniture, the colors on the walls, the locks on the doors. Every detail was mine. Freedom wasn't glamorous, it was peace, and peace was priceless. Grace remained by my side, guiding me through the aftermath, while Daniel's article won awards, shining a light on hidden abuse in perfect families. He told me once over coffee, "Your story isn't just yours anymore. It's a weapon against silence." I nodded, knowing he was right. That's why I said yes when a publisher approached me. The journal I had once written in secret became a book, finally silent my voice against abuse. It hit shelves within weeks of my parents' sentencing, and letters poured in. Survivors wrote of bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, of mothers who turned away, of brothers who smirked while pain blossomed. They said my story gave them courage to speak. I also established the Carter Foundation, not to honor my family name, but to redefine it. The funds went to shelters, legal aid, therapy for survivors. I visited one shelter, often sitting with women whose eyes mirrored my own from years past. I told them, "You're not weak for staying. You're strong for surviving. And you're even stronger for choosing to leave." Every time I felt my grandmother's presence, as though she whispered that I was finally building the legacy she would have wanted. Not everything healed overnight. Some nights I still woke with my father's voice ringing in my ears, or the sound of a lighter scratching in the dark. But each morning I chose not to let those memories define me. Therapy helped. Writing helped. Speaking helped. Step by step, I reclaimed the pieces of myself that they had tried to destroy. The Carter name was no longer one of power or envy. It was a cautionary tale whispered about in boardrooms and dinner tables. Richard sat in a cell stripped of influence. Diane counted her days behind bars. Ethan drifted in obscurity, his golden boy shine tarnished. For once, their shadows no longer touched me. As I closed my speech at the auditorium, I looked into the sea of faces and said, "For years, I believed silence was survival, but silence nearly killed me. Speaking saved me, and speaking can save you too." Applause erupted, not polite, but thunderous, echoing through the hall. I stepped back, smiling, not the forced smile I had worn for cameras, but one born of freedom. I walked off stage into the sunlight pouring through the windows, my heart lighter than it had ever been. I was no longer the broken daughter of the Carters. I was Natalie Carter, survivor, author, advocate, and I was finally undeniably free.